Welcome to the Nathan Trust podcast. My name is Mark Nathan. I'm a director at Nathan Trust, and I'm here with Jim Power, who's an economist, and we're going to discuss a bit about corporate Ireland. Nice to meet you anyway. We have a lot of clients who are international, and a lot of things they want to know, I suppose, the landscape of Ireland, what's it like to do business here. Jim, I'd like to discuss a bit about the history of corporate Ireland from an international point of view. Can you just give us a bit of detail on that?
Okay, I mean, in understanding the Irish economy today, the influence and impact of foreign direct investment is absolutely phenomenal. At the end of last year, there was just over 300,000 direct employees working for companies that were supported by the IDA. In other words, foreign direct investment. And in the first half of this year, another 8,900 jobs were created by IDA sponsored companies. Okay, so you're talking about employment in excess of 300,000 out of a workforce of about 2.6 million. However, for every one job in the multinational sector, there is 0.7% of a job supported in the rest of the economy. So in other words, all those supply services that are sold, and many of those are SMEs that are sold into the multinational companies. So you're talking about, close to 600,000 jobs directly and indirectly dependent on the multinational sector. And of course, those jobs tend to be higher paid than other jobs in the economy. So it's an incredibly important part of the economic model. And to understand where we are today, actually, you have to go back to the 1950s. In the 40s and 50s, Ireland was a very inward-looking country where external investment was not welcomed, where foreign trade didn't really happen. Agriculture absolutely dominated the economic landscape. And we definitely had, under De Valera, a policy of trade protectionism. Okay, in 1958, we got the first programme for economic development with Sean Lemass, and that was the beginning of a new era for the Irish economy. And as the 60s proceeded into the 1970s, there was a clear recognition that, for a country with a population of less than 3 million at the time, the domestic market was never going to be large enough to sustain a functioning economy. So the view was taken, we've got to become more outward looking. There has to be a much greater focus on the export side of the economy. But also a key part of the strategy was to put in place a tax system that would incentivize multinational investment in the country. And, up to the late 90s, we had a 10% manufacturing tax rate. Since the late 90s, there is a 12.5% tax rate for corporate activities. So there was an explicit policy to attract foreign direct investment into the country. And as the 70s progressed into the 80s, into the 90s, indeed into the 2000s, we've seen massive growth in the multinational part of the economy. That did not happen by accident. It was a deliberate strategy on the part of the Irish government. It has paid very handsome dividends because, as I say, over 300,000 people directly employed, close to the same again indirectly employed by those companies. 57% of the corporation tax take last year came from 10 multinational companies. Employees in the multinational sector pay an incredibly high level of the income tax take we get in this country. So in many ways, multinational investment has been the economic model. It has paid very handsome dividends. And if you think about where we're sitting today in Cork, for example, if you look at the contribution that the chemical and pharmaceutical sector makes to this local economy, it's incredibly important. You look at the Midwest medtech, you look at Galway medtech, throughout the country, multinational investment is incredibly important. As I say, the big driver of that was the 12.5% corporation tax rate, which is still amongst the lowest in the European Union. But it was also built on the back of a very open attitude to business. We were seeing as a flexible, agile economy. We were able to offer a very highly educated English-speaking labour force. And also, I guess this is one of the advantages that a small country has. You know, if a chief executive in a Silicon Valley tech company wants to come to Ireland and wants to set up a meeting with the Taoiseach, that can be arranged within hours. So the access to the political system was also very important. So it was a combination of factors, but basically because of a deliberate long-term strategy, multinational investment has become an incredibly important part of the economic model. And of course, those multinational companies coming in here also changed the behaviour of indigenous companies, because indigenous companies were forced to take on best practice, and the overall result was that it created a very dynamic corporate environment here that remains very much a key part of the economic model.
Yeah, so what we find, the 12.5% tax rate used to be a huge incentive, but there's other areas now like access to multinational companies here for other suppliers, access to staff and all that. It's not just the key driver anymore, the tax rate. We're finding it's a multiple of things. Is that coming out? Are you seeing that as well? Or?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. The tax rate was the key selling point for Ireland over many years. That tax model is obviously coming under international pressure. You know, we've seen the OECD tax deal that has been agreed. Pillar 2 of that was a minimum corporation tax rate of 15%. For companies with turnover in excess of 750 million. That was implemented at the beginning of this year. That was Pillar 2. Pillar 1 is coming down the tracks, and basically Pillar 1, and you know, as an accountant you'd understand this a lot better than I would, okay? But basically what Pillar 1 means is that companies will have to pay more corporation tax in the jurisdiction where they do business rather than in the jurisdiction where the balance sheet resides. So that definitely is another challenge to Ireland's corporation tax environment. So I think the bottom line is that while still important, the corporation tax rate and the system here has become less of a differentiator, and it is being gradually chipped away. And of course, at the same time, we have intense competition for mobile investment coming from many other countries. So now I think it's really important that we focus in on all of the other attributes of our offering. So the availability of an English-speaking labour force is really, well-educated labour force is really important. The quality of public services, health, education, the infrastructure, the IT infrastructure, say that the health service is really important. The availability and affordability of housing is very important. So we have got to focus in on all of those other non-tax elements of our offering to make sure that in a rapidly evolving world, changing world, where competition for mobile investment is becoming more intense, that we have to address all of these other areas. And to me, top of the pile at this point is the availability and affordability of housing, either to buy or to rent. But also, if you think about, you know, multinational companies coming in here, making a decision to invest, they're obviously bringing in staff to work here. So the personal tax system is important. We discussed in a previous podcast the importance of stuff like inheritance tax. All of these elements are now going to become much more important. So in other words, Ireland will have to run faster and faster to stand still. And to do that, we will need strong political commitment, and we will also need to ensure that the IDA continues to be resourced properly to do the very successful job it's doing. The other point I think that is important for Ireland as a differentiator at the moment is, since the Brexit vote in June 2016, Ireland is now the only native English-speaking country in the European Union, with the exception of tiny Malta. So that definitely conveys an advantage on Ireland for US companies particularly, or indeed Canadian companies that want to access the EU market. Ireland still represents a very attractive location, and Brexit has actually enhanced that. One warning I think you would give in this regard is that, okay, during the chaos that followed the Brexit referendum in the UK, the political instability, the policy instability, It's the UK has become a very unstable, volatile political environment, but that I think has now changed. Since the election on July 4th, we have a Labour government that has a very strong majority, and I think the UK political and policy backdrop is going to become much more stable. And as a consequence of that, I think the UK will become once again a more significant competitor for Ireland in the foreign direct investment space.
I think it's a very competitive area, as you said, and I think we recently announced the summer economic statement there. Surely there's kind of areas of Ireland further kind of going to invest in the infrastructure, or what has come from that statement that further kind of keeps them at the top of the pile over the UK and other English-speaking European jurisdictions.
Yeah, the summer economic statement, which was published on July 9th, it basically sets the fiscal and economic backdrop for the budget, which is happening on the 1st of October this year. And basically, the government has said the budget package is going to be 8.3 billion, which is very significant. 6.9 billion of that is going to be on expenditure and 1.4 billion on tax measures. Okay. The problem I have with that sort of budgetary package is that a lot of it is going into current spending on the day-to-day running of the country. I would prefer to see a much greater sort of a longer term strategic focus on addressing the areas that need most attention, particularly in the context of Ireland remaining attractive for foreign direct investment and indeed for indigenous companies. And housing, is top of the pile. I do think we need a more aggressive long-term strategy to significantly ramp up the delivery of housing. And that's not all finance. It has a lot to do with the planning system and so on. But that tends to be the problem with the annual budget. It's short-term in nature. A lot of the money goes on the day-to-day running of the country. But, having said that, we are in a pretty decent place in the sense that we will have an 8.3 billion package at least, and it'll be ramped up by other measures on budget day itself. But we can deliver all of that as we did last year while still maintaining a budget surplus. So, Ireland is generating very significant levels of taxation, and that is facilitating the spending that government is engaging in. One thing that I guess I think about an awful lot is the fact that we hear a lot of accusations being made towards economists, particularly about being obsessed with economic growth and GDP and caring a lot less about society. My response to that would be that to generate the tax revenue to fund a functioning society, you need a functioning economic model. And a functioning economic model in an Irish context means that we remain attractive for foreign direct investment, that we invest in long-term infrastructure, particularly IT infrastructure, but also housing, both for rental and home ownership purposes. So a functioning economy is vital to generate the resources. And the reason why we have had a series of very generous budget packages while still maintaining a budget surplus is on the back of tax revenue buoyancy. We took in over 83 billion in taxation in 2023. We're going to take in, that was a record, we're going to take in even more this year. So it shows the importance of maintaining a functioning economy. And as I said earlier, the multinational component is a key part of that.
Yeah, so we have a lot of clients and they're always kind of the future outlook of if they're looking to set up in Ireland and continue to do business in Ireland. I think the corporate tax rate looks to be harmonised. I don't see any more further kind of attack on that from a kind of top line point of view. I think one of the things is the political side. They do question another government in what kind of impact that potentially could have on the economy. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess the first point to make is that nobody should ever forget the fact that political events do have economic consequences. We had the Brexit referendum in the UK on the 23rd of June 2016. that had a dramatic impact on the UK economy. We had the election of Donald Trump in November 2016, which had a dramatic impact on the world economy, particularly in relation to free trade and protectionism and so on. And we see around the world in recent times, extreme politics coming to the fore. We look at what's going on in France. We look at, the Russian situation. The United States is becoming much more politically polarized, and we're seeing the growth of more extreme politics, either extreme right or extreme left. All of the focus tends to be on the rise of the extreme right, but we also have, the rise of the extreme left, France being an example of that in the recent National Assembly elections. Ireland is certainly, running against that trend. The European and local elections send out a very strong message from Ireland that we remain wedded to the centre, to non-extreme politics. The one challenge to that, I'm not making a political statement here, but if Sinn Féin were to come into government, that could represent a significant change in the economic policy environment in Ireland. Because Sinn Féin has traditionally had very different and more extreme economic policy prescriptions than parties like Labour, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, the Green Party. And perhaps 5 years ago I would have really worried about particularly the tax policies of Sinn Féin, that they could disincentivise inward investment into Ireland and also force the exodus of wealth from the country and wealthy people and higher earners. Sinn Féin's popularity has fallen significantly in the last 12 months. That doesn't suggest that this is a permanent thing. This can all change ahead of a general election, which must be held before the 22nd of March next year. But I do think Sinn Féin's economic policy platform has become less dramatic. Sinn Féin is being pulled towards the centre as well. So, if Sinn Féin did get into government, it will be as part of a coalition. And as you know, when you're forming a coalition, it's compromise. So they would have to go into government with somebody like Fianna Fáil, and that would involve compromises. So I don't think the implications for the Irish economy of Sinn Féin getting into government would be as serious today as would have been the case 5 years ago.
Okay.
And also the fact that Sinn Féin is falling in the opinion polls would also, I think, strengthen that argument. But anyway, I guess as an economist, I spend most of my life at this stage analysing political events rather than economics per se, because, as I said, these political events do have significant economic consequences. So over the coming months, I will be watching very closely how Sinn Féin is doing in the opinion polls, trying to project what sort of government we're likely to get in Ireland after the general election, and most importantly, what the economic policy platform of Sinn Féin is, because that platform hasn't been that clear to date. But in the run-up to a general election, Sinn Féin will have to become much more explicit about its economic policy agenda, and particularly in relation to taxation. And I'm not picking on Sinn Féin, but Sinn Féin is where the focus will have to be, because we know what Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are all about in terms of economic and taxation policy, because they've been in government, whereas Sinn Féin is a bit of an unknown entity. So a lot to watch on the political front, but I think everybody should remember that point, that maybe I'm just being a conservative economist here, but I do believe the centre is the best place to be. Extreme politics is not good. Extreme policy is not good. It gives rise to uncertainty, volatility, and as I said, these political events can have, and generally do have, significant economic consequences. So we should be careful what we wish for.
I agree with you completely that for the outlook of our clients, we're recommending a kind of a centralist kind of political aspect to it. So I think that's good for them. I want to move away from just kind of corporate Ireland and how successful it is, because it has been hugely successful. We're in a building here, and it's all international companies and all that. So I want to go back down to the kind of the individual, and I suppose do you have any? What's your understanding of like people migrating back from say the UK and the States coming to Ireland, and how Ireland is becoming a bit more attractive for the individual internationally? Do you have any thoughts on that and why that's happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, the treatment of non-domiciles has been quite favourable in Ireland relative to many other jurisdictions.
Yeah.
So there is certainly an attraction for higher earners, people with wealth, to come into this country. And that is actually really important at the end of the day, because if you are attracting foreign direct investment into the country, you are trying to attract, highly qualified, well-paid people, perhaps with wealth, into the country. So it's important that the tax system remains as conducive as possible to attracting those people in. And Ireland's tax system in relation to non-domiciles has proven quite attractive and quite effective. The UK has always been seen as one of the main competitors for this type of individual, but following the spring 2024 budget changes in the UK, more uncertainty and I think a greater disadvantage has been created for the UK in that regard. So actually the changes in the UK could play into Ireland's favour going forward. Of course, the caveat here is we've just had a change of government in the UK. Will there be further changes to the treatment of non-domiciles in the UK? It remains to be seen. But at this point, the recent announcements in the UK certainly, I think, offer some advantage to Ireland. And as I say, I think it is important because, at the end of the day, being able to attract wealthy, high-paid, talented I'm not saying one follows the other, but highly skilled, talented individuals into the country is really, really important.
And what we're seeing as well is traditionally Ireland was a kind of a place where you would immigrate from to Australia, the States, when you turned mid-20s. A lot of those people are almost staying locally in Dublin and Cork, where those jobs are available. So I think that falls into like the talent. There's a greater pool of talent here for multinationals, and I suppose that's reflected on the income tax take, isn't it?
Yes, it is indeed. As I said, 57% of corporation tax comes from 10 US companies. I assume they don't tell us what they are, but they are all US companies, multinationals. Also, a significant portion of income tax comes from the employees of those multinational companies. So it is really important to try and sustain that sort of model into the future. And, stuff like the treatment of non-domiciles is really important in that regard. Can I just ask you a question, if I may, Mark? In terms of your business activities with international clients, how do they view the treatment of non-domiciles here?
They're still very surprised that there's no actual ceiling on the time spent here. So the UK have been chipping away at it for the last 10 years. I think, and here you can be on a remittance tax base here for indefinitely. There's no restriction on time. So a lot of them are kind of find it refreshing when they come across that.
Okay.
So.
And that's why the changes in the UK in the spring budget.
Yeah, it's getting tighter and tighter. The years that you're allowed to stay in the States. That it's getting tighter on the time frame. Traditionally, there was you could be non-dom indefinitely. It went down to a kind of a 15, 16 year period then. And now I think they're proposing 4 years, and then they tax you on your kind of worldwide income as such.
Okay.
So that's the proposal. So it's very much top of the agenda of the Labour Party on the non-dom stuff. He's actually mentioned it numerous times. So we do see changes, and we do see an uptick in a lot of queries over the past 2 or 3 months on particular non-doms looking potentially as Ireland as an alternative jurisdiction for them to become a resident here.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, my perspective would be that, we are a very small, very open, very internationalized economy. I think we need to be as open as possible to attracting people like that into the country. I mean, you'd be much closer to this than I would, obviously, but do you detect at a political level here any appetite to change that?
You don't hear it. You don't hear it on the actual. You don't hear it on the radio or the TV as much. Richie Sunak's wife was a non-dom, so like it was politically front and centre in the UK. You don't get to hear any narrative about it in Ireland at all. So I don't envision any changes to it in the short term, but who knows in the long term it could change, you know. But at the moment I don't see there's a pressure from Irish taxpayers to change it locally as such, you know.
Yeah, and I think it just I think re-emphasises for me the importance of stability. You know, the importance of a sensible, stable approach to economic policy. I mean, I'm not here arguing for one moment that Ireland is perfect.
Yeah.
You know, we have challenges. Yeah. Housing is a massive challenge. The quality of public services like health is a massive challenge. Investment in infrastructure is a massive challenge. Investment in education is a massive challenge. There's still you know, a requirement to invest a lot of money in the Irish economic structure. But the bottom line is there is no country in the world that is perfect. You know, you name any country that doesn't have challenges, you struggle to do it. You know, even the French healthcare system, which has been traditionally regarded as one of the best in the world by the World Health Organization, is significantly under pressure. The Scandinavian economic model and social model is under significant pressure. You know, it's a nature. It's human nature. And you know, I think to me, the really important thing is that policymakers should take a long-term strategic perspective on where they want to see Ireland going and making sure that long-term plans are put in place to deliver that. And that tends to be one of the problems. You know, politics does complicate that because for politicians, the long term doesn't extend beyond the next election. So getting re-elected is the priority, and that kind of militates against long-term planning. But the experience after 1958 in this country proves that if you do engage in long-term strategic planning, it does work.
Just so I want to kind of segue a small bit, where does Ireland, do you think, sit in Europe, as in politically now, and where do you think it'll sit politically in the next, say, 10 years? Is it just going to, since England is gone now, so there's not a common law jurisdiction, there's only one common law real jurisdiction in Europe, so where do you see Ireland as a kind of a place, you know, is it going to be? Yeah,
I mean, I'd have mixed views on this. Okay, I always believed, I firmly believe that the decision by the UK to leave the European Union was a massive mistake at every level. I couldn't possibly, to me, it was one of the clearest economic calls that I ever had to make, that this is disastrous. It is not going to be good for the UK, and everything we've subsequently seen, you know, bears that out. And to me, it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure that one. You know, walking away from free access to a massive European market does not make sense to do trade deals with countries thousands of miles away. So there is that aspect. But I also felt that from an Irish perspective, Ireland did lose a significant ally when Britain left the European Union, because over the years in many areas, particularly in relation to tax competency, the UK was always on the same sheet as Ireland, basically that taxation should remain a national competency. And this was in the face of significant pressure from the French and the Germans to force Ireland to change its tax system. But the UK was an important ally in that regard, and with the UK gone, you know, I think Ireland has definitely become more exposed. I think it has become a little bit more peripheral, and that's why it is so important that at an EU Commission level, that the people we have out there representing Ireland are as strong as possible, because Ireland will have to shout louder and louder to maintain a significant voice within the European Union. So bottom line is, I do think that Britain leaving the European Union has actually diluted Ireland's influence in the European Union. But one thing that is reassuring in that regard is the fact that the European Union, during the Brexit negotiations, particularly in relation to Northern Ireland, the EU was very firmly behind Ireland and supported Ireland in terms of what was going to achieve. So that was important as well. But I think we should not take it for granted. You know, as I say, I think our position in the European Union has been diluted somewhat. My hope actually would be that under a Labour government and Keir Starmer, that there will be an attempt made to integrate the UK more into Europe again. I'm not suggesting for one moment that another referendum will be held. I can't see that happening in this generation. But I would hope that the Labour government will start exploring stuff like becoming part of the single European market or the customs union again, and rebuilding those bridges that were so dramatically damaged by people like Boris Johnson. So I think that actually would play to Ireland's benefit.
Okay, great. I don't have anything else really. Sorry, it's a cut it there. Do you have anything else, sir? Is it? How long is that, or?
That is 32 minutes.
Maybe if you want to ask me to wrap it, a final question. So, how, if you don't agree, tell me to shut up, okay?
No, go for it.
But how do I just see Ireland into the future? You know?
Okay, we'll start there.
Yeah, and you can ask that question.
Okay, some very interesting topics discussed there. Thanks for that. I just like to wrap it up, and just one question I have is, where do you see Ireland, say, over the in the future, as in 10, 15, 25, the next generation? How do you see Ireland set up for them?
Okay, I mean, I think at this juncture today, Ireland is in a pretty good place. We have an unemployment rate of 4.2% of the labour force, which is virtually full employment. We have employment over 2.6 million, which is a record high. The public finances, notwithstanding the fact we do have a significant level of national debt, but the public finances are in a pretty decent place. We're still running budget surpluses, which is very different to many other European countries at the moment. So, and the multinational piece, as I suggested, is still strong here. So Ireland today is in a pretty good place. If you extrapolate forward, I would be pretty optimistic in the sense that, you know, we recognise the importance of being able to provide a well-educated labour force, you know, to potential investors into the country. We do recognise the importance of having a tax system that is somewhat competitive. But if somebody told me that we would have a long-term strategy in relation to addressing housing, in relation to addressing the quality of public services like health and education, making sure the infrastructure is as developed as possible, and also taking on the alternative energy agenda more aggressively. And it was interesting that one of the first things the Labour government has announced in the UK is that it has removed the ban on onshore wind development. So I think renewable energy is an absolute must for Ireland into the future, because we can become actually global leaders in the development of renewable energy given our island status. So we cannot take anything for granted, but if we address all of those areas and have a long-term strategic view, I would be pretty optimistic about Ireland's longer-term prospects. But as I've said earlier, to me, socially, economically, politically, housing should be top of the agenda.